My name is Elle, and I'm a transgender woman talking about grief. I had the privilege of spending some time recently with some friends, and they brought to my attention a quote by Edith Eger. And I don't really know anything about this person. I'm curious about reading their work. But the quote goes like this: all therapy is grief work. It goes on to say, a process of confronting a life where you expect one thing and get another, a life that brings you the unexpected, and unanticipated. All therapy is grief work. And I deeply resonate with that quote, but I also think that there is a way in which transition is grief. Like transition itself is a process of mourning what wasn't, like what didn't happen, what can't happen, what's prevented. It's mourning the life that I wish that I had. It's mourning the life that I wish I could have in the future. It's mourning the expectations of what I imagined life would be. It's mourning, in my case, the loss of privilege, the loss of cisgender privilege, the loss of male privilege. It's been a massive amount of grief. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about grief, talk about some of the ways in which transition for me has been a process of grief, and how perhaps, I don't really know other than like kind of a vague theory, but I wonder if for some folks they're not able to grieve well as they go through transition, and so pick up different unhelpful coping mechanisms, as people do with grief in general. Unless we're able to do it well, we pick up all kinds of coping mechanisms. So I wanted to reflect on that a little bit, and also reflecting on some of my experiences with grief over the course of my life, and how transition as grief has been the same or different. So before I get into that, though, I just wanted to say thanks for coming along the journey with me. Thanks for joining. This program has been going weekly ever since last summer, and my intent is to continue doing that every week. I do feel like it might be a little bit ambitious to put out these video versions of the show. I'm not sure. You can let me know what you think. But it's been an absolute joy to hear from so many of you. I've received many, many emails from lots of different folks who have given feedback, asked questions, sent encouragement, given constructive tips, their opinions about the program. It's been really heartwarming. So thank you for that. And I guess I just want to say thank you for tuning in. There's several hundred of us who are here every single week, and it's really an honor to be with you. And so thanks for reaching out, for looking me up, for sharing if you're able to do that. I know many of you are kind of in the process of self-questioning, and you're closeted, or maybe you're not even sure the answer to some of those questions about whether or not you're trans. But I appreciate it. And also, I really value and appreciate your ratings and review for the show, whether that's on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, or even your comments and likes on YouTube. Especially since I'm putting forth the effort to get it out there. I appreciate that that assistance by the way of giving me your input. So back to our topic for today's program. The way I understand it is that grief is our bodies and our emotions, like physical and emotional response to loss, right? So the emotional part would be feelings of sadness, but then there's like kind of this whole bodily, sensory, social, spiritual, physical, like it's this overwhelming experience that of course includes sadness, but also many other types of emotions and activities and thought processes. Grief is this thing that we go through. It's like passing through a dark forest, or maybe entering into a dark forest that gets thinner over time. I've heard so many different metaphors for grief. But it's what happens when we lose something. And, those losses can be quite literal. I experienced a house fire as a child, or as a very, very young adult or teenager. And in that fire, our home and all our possessions were lost, but also my brother. And the most profound and deeply cutting loss that I've been through in my life. But that's not the only one. I've been through many, many others, including losing friends and other family members to death. I've experienced loss by way of my parents were divorced when I was an infant. And so that was a different kind of loss, a loss of a certain type of family, a loss of the regular presence of my other parent. That parent was my dad, and he went through his own process of addiction, which created more losses for me and for him and for our whole family. But even thinking back generationally, recently I was thinking about how my dad was adopted by my grandparents, which is a beautiful gift. And at the same time, not being able to have a relationship with that, wider family, that adopted family, is a loss. I actually have become connected, it's funny, through one of those DNA, those DNA family tree things you can take. I actually showed up on some people's family tree who were not expecting me to be there. And they reached out and they're like, hey, you're my first cousin twice removed, or I don't know, whatever random thing. And I was like, yeah, actually, my dad is your grandfather's child and we're cousins, and sorry, surprise. And like, it was really interesting because that extended family, I think, has some wealth. My dad's biological father had, some degree of notoriety and money. And, in the 1950s, like, having a child out of wedlock was not becoming for someone who was in his social class. And so my dad had to disappear, which is kind of how the story began. And so there's a lot of people in that extended family who are still living, who knew my biological grandfather, who like don't believe this story. And despite the fact that we're in their family tree, according to our DNA, it's like kind of hysterical. But that's another loss. So there's layers and layers of losses. We can have losses of relationships. We can have losses, of course, of like physical objects or items, like a home. We can have losses that are associated with, title or reputation, or we can even have losses that are associated with mindsets or beliefs or things we think about the world or expectations. It's like, there are many different things that we grieve, and essentially kind of like Edith Eger said, that like life is this constant process of confronting reality as compared to expectations. We wanted one thing, we felt like we were promised one thing, we expected one thing, and yet something else comes to us, something else comes our way. And, you know, I think that, the process of grief is not necessarily to like pretend like there wasn't a loss. Grief is not to like minimize the loss or to make it seem like it wasn't a big deal. Grief is not like necessarily even like getting over it per se, or not feeling sad anymore, or not having any of the negative thoughts or whatever that may go along with it. I don't think that that's necessarily the process of grief either. Grief, in my experience, is a process of change. It's a process of having a new mind and a new perspective about our lives. Grief is about accurate expression of emotion. Grief is about effective, helpful coping mechanisms for the feelings that we're having. Grief is about acceptance. And grief is, at its best, grief leads us in sort of a new sense of embodied being, a new sense of holiness or wholeness, right? It leaves us as a new kind of person. And like at its best, and a lot of times when we're going through grief, it's really hard to believe that that's true. And that's part of why it's so dark. And in fact, telling someone that they're going to get through grief and that they're going to come out the other side, a more whole and holy person, and that they're going to be a better person for it, like that kind of message actually isn't very helpful and actually can be really hurtful or traumatic. And so it's not really typically a message that I tell people who are going through grief. It's only something I think that you can like discover on the other side of grief. And that certainly has been the case for me throughout my life and the many different types of grief that I've been through. And especially for the grief that is transition. I think that one of the things that kept me from choosing to go through transition for so many years was because I think I intuitively, or maybe even very, very explicitly, knew the losses that would come my way. I don't know if anyone in my life, at least anyone who's accepting, ever came to me and said, well, why did you wait so long? Why didn't you tell us? I don't know if I don't think that anyone was really that rude or, callous to actually say that, but it's a thought that definitely came to my mind. And, the truth is that, the part of the reason that I waited so long was because of reactions like that. Part of the reason I waited so long was because of what happened when I came out. Like, it was chaos and really, really hard and awful. And I had terrible, uncomfortable conversations with people, and I've lost many, many people. Lots of people have disappeared from my life and my world. The layers of loss have been massive for me, and that's part of the reason why I waited so long, why I delayed being honest about this stuff. It was like, if I could possibly do anything else, if I could possibly be anything else other than trans, I wanted to be that, because the threats that were in front of me, the losses that I could see, the grief that I knew I would have to go through was so incredibly immense. One of the things that I was particularly afraid of losing. One of the things that I wasn't ready to grieve was my career. I was a pastor before I transitioned, and I know if you listen to the show before, you know that I'm currently in therapy school and working to get my second master's degree so that I can be a licensed clinical couple and family therapist here in California, which will be a beautiful thing. I'm getting to practice right now as a student in my clinical practicum that's ongoing. But you know, I was a pastor for all those years, and for me, being a pastor was a calling. It was something that was in my heart and in my soul, and in many ways, that calling is still with me. I still identify as a pastor, at least insofar as my life is here to guide people into inclusion, to welcome people to the table of grace, to make sure that they know that they're loved and wanted and enough. And I'm doing that now and will in the future do that through a different type of vocation. But in terms of like my soul and my sense of calling, it's still there, And but I knew that I was going to lose the vocation. And, I've been a pastor for a very long time. I went to undergraduate. I got a degree in theology, and I minored in biblical languages. I took multiple years of Greek and Hebrew. I was an ancient Greek tutor for a couple of years for the Greek professor. I really loved Greek. I really got into it. And I pastored in my first church in Central Washington. And then I was at my home church in Walla Walla for 10 years and got to do all kinds of stuff in that home church. It was a big church, several thousand members and great, big, huge auditorium. We had amazing music, and I got to be involved in planning the services, and I did all kinds of creative, like graphic design kind of work. And it was really fun. I really enjoyed the team and a lot of the different people that I got to work with. And then I got the opportunity finally to be a lead pastor of a multi-pastor church. We had 5 different full-time people on staff at the church down here in Redlands, and they hired me and paid for us to move from Washington. And, it was amazing. It was like I was finally I wouldn't say that I was like at the pinnacle, but I was at the peak of my career, and I was getting to do what I loved the most, which was preach, and I had a little podcast that I had made, and I got to speak every single week and write sermons and create, and I got to, get paid to like show up at kids' basketball games from the school, or, go to the hospital, or, see people, or whatever it happens to be. Like, that was my life, and it was really wonderful. And I knew that, almost without any doubt. I mean, there were moments where I'd kind of like, sort of hoped that it would be different, like there were moments where I hoped that like, maybe the church would like say, no, actually we want you to stay. You're such a good pastor, and, we don't care if you're transitioning. That was sort of my fantasy. But, the reality is that was like very unlikely, and that proved to be true. I lost my career, essentially from the moment that I let the administrators know that I was going to be transitioning. They let me know that there would not be a way for me to continue being employed despite that being my wishes. And so I had to resign. I mean, I didn't have to resign. They would have fired me or whatever, but that's kind of what you do. You resign, and that's sort of the proper way of doing things. So I resigned, and that was the end of it. All that time, all that money, I'm still paying for my seminary degree. All that investment just gone, poof. And, I know that there are other denominations out there, and there are other churches, and there are other types of religion that are accepting, but at least for me, it was like, I didn't have the stomach to like roll the dice again I didn't want to invest another 20 years in something that could disappear like that. And now, I suppose that like psychotherapy could change in such a way that therapists are obsolete and no longer needed. And I guess I'm running that risk. That's a possibility going forward, but I feel like it's probably unlikely that that will happen, at least in my lifetime. And so, that was tragic for me. I mean, that loss directly associated with my transition. I cried and cried and cried and cried. Essentially, since I lost my brother, I'd never cried so much in my life. It's been like 20 years since my brother passed, 20s, 22, 23 years. And like literally, I don't think, almost without a doubt, I haven't cried as much as I did losing my career as I did for him. Like it was a massive loss. And some of the things that have compounded that are the loss of that community, because like when you're a pastor, it's like your whole world is wrapped up in that. At least that's how it was for me. Like my church was my social system. They were my support group. They were my friends and my coworkers. They were my entertainment. I don't really know. That kind of sounds crass, but like my whole life was soaked up in the church, and they're all almost entirely gone. There's two girls that are really lovely that I get to spend time with about once a month and have been just a godsend, and they're members of that church still. And we've had fun together, getting to know each other a little bit, getting to know each other on this side of transition, and that's been great. There aren't many others who have reached out, if at all. But certainly that isn't a space that's safe for us. It's not a space that's safe for our family. It's not a space that we're wanted in. I was talking with one of my friends who is trans, and I said, we've been shunned. And I guess I don't know how afraid I was of being shunned, but it certainly has happened. And I know that the experience of shunning from your community is loss, and it's grief. A lot of what I've talked about on the podcast, whether it's, the loss of privilege or the loss of different roles or societal condemnation of us, or even just like the experience of having a sense of peace and a sense of stability about one's future. All of those things are things that have been lost for me. It's really been a profound shift in many ways in my life, and transition has brought that about. I'm not sure if I talked about this yet on any of the other episodes, or any of the other Am I Transgender episodes, and I'm going to do another one in that series. I'm kind of wanting to space them out. You understand? But I do have many more parts. I bet I have 4, 5, 6 more parts to that series. We'll probably be at part 10 by the time I'm done with it. But one of the things that led me to, or helped me to understand and realize that I was trans, and that my experience was what a lot of people call gender dysphoria, was this aching, deep longing, which is grief, for the childhood that I didn't have, for the body that I was not born with, for the experiences that I missed out on. In some ways, even, I feel some gratitude for having been spared decades of misogyny. And also, I feel some degree of sadness for not um, having some of the experiences of camaraderie that many women do with each other, often that have to do with experiences of misogyny or sexism. I don't know if that makes sense or if that sounds really, really awful. And I really, do not intend to um, glamorize the pain that many women, cis and trans folks, go through. It's not, something where I wish that I'd gone through pain, that I'm not really a masochist. But I also think that there's a certain amount of community that is built around shared suffering. And I didn't go through a lot of that suffering, which is, a relief in its own. But also it's like, I'm on the outside, and that's just the reality. I do have a different set of suffering that I've gone through, some of which I'm talking about here. But the camaraderie that creates is like more with other trans folks, which itself is really, it's wonderful. But it's not necessarily like what my soul thinks it wants and needs. Which I guess kind of goes back to that stuff that Edith Eger says, where grief, it comes up at the intersection of expectations and reality. Lots of different griefs have come my way. There's been grief at times in this process of transition where, I've had regrets at how I didn't have the courage to speak up in the past. And, I totally believe and agree with kind of that spirit that I mentioned of, that, I guess I had a therapist early on in the process who said, if you could have, you would have. If you could have, you would have. And it was sort of a way of kind of embracing the fact that, the time that I was able to come out and go through transition and do what I needed to do, that was the time that I was able to do it, and not a moment before. And so it doesn't really make sense to like be racked in like guilt or in, self-loathing or even necessarily a whole bunch of sadness about it, because it's happened at the time it's supposed to happen. But yet, sorting out those feelings and coming to that conclusion, if I could have, I would have, that is what grief looks and feels like. I've talked many times on the show about that transition ceremony that I created. And in a lot of ways, that was, a ritual of grief. In fact, we had a whole section that involved ashes, and there were ashes that were sprinkled, and it was ashes. The ashes were actually created from some documents and some clothing, or shall I say, some textiles and some papers that held significance for me in my previous part of life. And I burned them one night. I spent several hours out burning and creating this pile of ashes that was later used in the ceremony. And part of the reason for that was that it was a recognition that this ceremony held weight as an activity of grief, and that I was laying to rest some of those old things. Some of them were those expectations, and some of it was like, kind of a recognition and a process of stepping into what would be next. And, it was really, really powerful. And there were ways in which it was a funeral. I remember at one point in that ceremony, and it wasn't like nobody died. Some trans people say, "Well, I'm dead," and they talk about dead name. You go back to the renaming episode to hear kind of more about that from my perspective. But I, I was going to say, my dad actually was at that ceremony and he made a speech and he talked about how, you know, there was a time where he sort of had talked about how he was going through grief and how, he was grieving the loss of his son and so on. But he made this statement that, and sort of said, but, I've discovered that, the loss or the grief that I had is more about the loss of my expectations or the loss of what I wished for or what I thought I had, as opposed to like the loss of an actual person. And I think maybe that's what people mean when they talk about grief as it relates to their, trans family member transitioning, where it's like there are a lot of expectations and hopes and dreams and assumptions that are on the table that when a person comes out as trans and transitions may be challenged or affected in some way. And I don't deny that that's true. I don't deny that that's hard. One of the things that I recently find myself grieving is when I'm out in public. I'm like when people look at me, they know that I'm a woman, but they also usually know that I'm trans. Like I'm present as a woman and people generally treat me as a woman, but I'm also very clockable. You can look at my face. God, I still have a beard shadow, even after years of treatments of facial hair. I'm 6'1". I'm a big broad, I'm a big broad with broad shoulders. And people can clock me. Maybe not all of them do, but I do think that a lot do. And I know I'm not like a stealth person. And so with that comes that knowledge that I carry with me, in my own head. And when I'm out in public walking around, like today we went to the mall to return some stuff, and I walk through the mall and people see me and they see this part of me that, at least for many years, was really vulnerable. It's much stronger now, and I'm growing, and maybe this is part of the grief process, but I'm growing to have, a greater sense of pride and a greater sense of appreciation for my own courage and my own vulnerability and being real and being honest. But yet, it's a grief in that when I'm out in public, I'm constantly aware of my transness. I'm constantly aware of how people see me. And, I do think that there is a part of that is an experience of femininity, to be under the gaze of the world or to be under the gaze of men in particular. And so there is, loss associated with male privilege, essentially, but also there's a degree of loss that is associated with cisgender privilege, where, when I was presenting myself as a man in the world, I didn't frequently think, I don't know, maybe I have to take that back a little bit, because I did frequently think, I frequently had feelings and thoughts of dysphoria about how I was presenting, but it wasn't quite as explicit and it wasn't quite as raw, and it certainly wasn't on the surface, and it wasn't as immediately painful. It was more like this dull ache underneath. It was like this 1,000 pinpricks of reminders about the life that I didn't have. And what's maybe troubling now about being out in public is that it's like an even more pointed reminder that the thing that I wished I had, that feminine childhood and just a quote unquote normal life as a girl, that thing that I wish I could have, it's like I still will never have that. I'm trans, and I'm making a life that I love and that I'm proud of, and yet it's not necessarily the life that I wish that I could have had. And at the same time, it's also a life that I am grateful for. And I think probably by the time that I'm dead, it will be a life that I wouldn't wish to be any different. And I think that that's maybe the key or the beauty that happens with grief, is in this strange way. If we really lean into our grief and we're really honest with it and we feel what we need to feel and we process and we go to therapy and we create rituals and we get back to the activities that we once loved and we discover new activities that we can love, and we wrap ourselves and are wrapped by other people as we engage in the world, as we go through this process of grief, we discover on the other side of it this strange sense of gratitude. And I remember as that happened, maybe 10 years after my brother was passed, as I thought back on that experience and how strangely grateful I was for it, because of the ways that I was able to empathize, and because of the ways that it opened up my heart, and because of the ways that it made my life better and made me a better person. I had this strange sense of gratitude, and it wasn't that I was happy that my brother was dead, but it was like I could see how I was a better person for it. And it felt like betrayal at first. It felt so gross and so disgusting, because it had been the most painful and difficult thing I'd ever been through in my life. And what the hell was I saying that I'm happy that this happened? And I wasn't saying that I was happy that it was happened, but I also was saying that I wouldn't want to go back to the person that I was before. And that's what it feels like right now for me to be trans. Being trans and going through transition is grief. It's hard and sad and confusing and difficult and maddening, and it's gut-wrenching. And somehow on the other side, many of us are able to emerge with this soulful sense of gratitude, this sense of recognition of the beauty that's in the world, and really, in a lot of ways, a testimony to the goodness and beauty that's available in the world, and the good enoughness that there can be in life. And that's where I think grief can lead us. That's where I hope that grief can lead you. And I don't know if this episode turned out the way that I had originally intended. I don't know if I said all the things that I was hoping to say. But I know that my soul is stirred a little bit, and I'm feeling that gratitude just now. Hope you're okay. Hope you're hanging in there. And whether you are grieving a process of transition or some other change or some other pain in your life, I just hope that you stick with it, and that you keep going through those woods, and that you keep trusting that the trees will thin out and that the light will break through. Thanks so much for joining me on this program. My name is Elle, and I'm a transgender woman talking.